From a British general whose entire strategy was sending more men into the same attack that kept failing, to an American commander who lost his nerve when his men needed him most, to the general who sent 300,000 of his own countrymen into a battle he knew they couldn't survive. These are the 7 worst generals of World War II. And number 4 on this list was arrested and executed by his own government, not for losing battles, but for what he said in private. Chapter 1. The general who sent men into a wall, Noel Irwin commanded Allied forces during the First Arakan campaign in Burma in 1942, and turned what should have been a straightforward offensive into one of Britain's most humiliating defeats of the entire war. Britain needed a victory. After the fall of Singapore and the loss of Burma the previous year, morale was at rock bottom. Irwin was given a clear objective: advance down the Arakan Peninsula, retake the port of Akyab, and prove that British forces could beat Japan on the ground. He had more men than the Japanese, better supplies, air support, every advantage that should have made this a manageable operation. It gets worse. Irwin launched his forces into frontal assaults against prepared Japanese defensive positions with almost no tactical imagination. The same positions, the same approach, the same result: British and Indian soldiers dying in the jungle while the Japanese sat in fortified bunkers and waited for the next wave. When his subordinate commander, General Slim, suggested flanking movements and alternative tactics, Irwin overruled him repeatedly. He was certain the answer was more pressure through the same approach that had already failed. The campaign collapsed completely by May 1943. British forces retreated, having achieved nothing except casualties. Irwin was relieved of command. The bitter irony: the subordinate he kept overruling was William Slim, who went on to become one of the most brilliant commanders of the entire war and eventually avenged every defeat Irwin had caused. Irwin's failure cost lives and time Britain couldn't afford to waste. The next general on this list wasted something even more valuable: the single greatest opportunity of the entire Italian campaign. If you're finding this valuable, subscribe. New stories every week. Chapter 2. The General Who Froze at Anzio. John Lucas commanded the Allied landings at Anzio in January 1944 and threw away the most significant strategic opportunity of the entire Italian campaign by refusing to advance when the road to Rome was completely open. The plan was audacious. Land Allied forces behind the German lines at Anzio, advance quickly inland, cut German supply lines, and potentially force the entire German position in Italy to collapse. Allied commanders estimated they had days, possibly a week, before Germany could respond with enough force to stop them. Lucas landed 36,000 men on January 22, 1944. The beach was virtually undefended. The roads north were open. German forces were completely unprepared for the landing's location. And then, he did nothing. For days, Lucas stayed on the beachhead, consolidating his position, building up supplies, waiting for conditions he considered adequate before advancing. While he waited, Field Marshal Kesselring moved German divisions from across Italy and beyond to surround the beachhead with overwhelming force. But here's what nobody talks about. Lucas wrote in his diary during those critical days that he felt he was being set up to fail. He was 54 years old, exhausted, and privately convinced the operation was too ambitious. That psychological defeat happened before a single German counterattack. By the time Lucas finally ordered an advance, the Germans had built a defensive ring so strong that Allied forces were pinned on the beachhead for 4 months. What should have been a decisive breakthrough became a grinding, attritional battle that cost over 100,000 casualties across the entire Anzio campaign. Lucas was relieved of command in February 1944. General Lucien Truscott replaced him and eventually broke out of the beachhead, proving the advance was always possible, just not under Lucas. Lucas froze when action was needed. The next general on this list didn't freeze. He actively made things worse at every opportunity he was given. Chapter 3. The Commander Who Stopped Leading. Walther von Brauchitsch served as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army from 1938 to 1941, the highest military position in Germany. At one of the most critical moments of the war, he became increasingly unable to stop Adolf Hitler from taking direct control of military strategy. The German army still had some of the finest professional officers in the world. Many of them privately warned that Hitler's growing interference would eventually destroy the army's ability to fight effectively. Brauchitsch was one of the few men with enough authority to challenge him. But that confrontation never truly came. Each time Hitler overruled his generals, Brauchitsch objected briefly before yielding. As Hitler's confidence grew after victories in Poland and France, the commander-in-chief of the army became less of a commander and more of an administrator. Professional military judgment slowly gave way to Hitler's personal decisions, and the consequences only grew larger. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the campaign slowed dramatically as winter approached. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. German commanders urged strategic withdrawals and realistic objectives. Hitler rejected many of those recommendations, and Brauchitsch failed to stop the Army High Command from losing what little independence it still had. By December 1941, Hitler dismissed him and took personal command of the German army himself. Many historians argue that moment marked a turning point. Germany no longer had a commander-in-chief capable of acting as a counterweight to Hitler's military decisions. The professional army had effectively lost its voice. Brauchitsch didn't lose Germany's wars by himself, but when decisive leadership was needed most, he failed to provide it. Subscribe before the next chapter. The general coming up didn't just fail his army. His own government arrested him for it after the war and put him in front of a firing squad. Chapter 4. The general shot by his own side. Vasili Gordov commanded the Soviet Stalingrad front in the summer of 1942, during the most critical phase of the entire Eastern War, and failed so completely that Stalin personally removed him after less than 2 months in command. The situation Gordov inherited was desperate but not yet lost. German forces were driving towards Stalingrad and the Volga River. Soviet forces were retreating but still capable of organized resistance. The question was whether a commander could stabilize the front long enough to build a coherent defense. Gordov could not. His command style created chaos rather than order. Contradictory orders confused his subordinates. Counterattacks were launched without adequate preparation and failed with heavy casualties. Units were committed piecemeal instead of concentrated where they could make a difference. The front continued collapsing, and it didn't stop there. Stalin replaced him with Yeremenko in August 1942, just weeks before the critical battle for Stalingrad itself began. The implication was clear. Stalin didn't trust Gordov with the battle that would determine the war's outcome. Gordov survived the war. He was promoted and given further commands. But in 1946, Soviet intelligence recorded private conversations in which Gordov made critical comments about Stalin and the Soviet system. He was arrested in 1950 and executed in 1951. The general who failed at Stalingrad's most critical moment was eventually shot by the government he had served, not for his military failures, but for saying out loud what most Soviet officers privately believed. What Gordov lost was a front. What the next general on this list lost was an entire army, and they weren't even his own men. Chapter 5. The general who sacrificed an ally's army. Ion Antonescu was Romania's military leader and sent 300,000 Romanian soldiers into the Stalingrad campaign in 1942, despite knowing they were inadequately equipped, poorly armed, and positioned on the most vulnerable flanks of the entire German line. Romanian forces defending the Don River flanks north and south of Stalingrad were holding positions that German military planners privately acknowledged were dangerously exposed. They had insufficient anti-tank weapons to stop Soviet armor. Their artillery was outdated. Their supply lines were stretched. Antonescu knew this. His own generals told him this. German advisors told him this. He sent them anyway, because maintaining Romania's alliance with Germany and his own political position required Romanian forces to be seen participating in the Great Eastern Campaign, regardless of whether they could survive it. When Soviet Operation Uranus struck in November 1942, it hit the Romanian flanks precisely because they were the weakest point. Romanian formations collapsed within hours. The encirclement of Paulus's Sixth Army was completed partly because 300,000 Romanian soldiers couldn't hold the line they were given. Of the 300,000 Romanian soldiers committed to the Stalingrad campaign, roughly 158,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Most of those taken prisoner died in Soviet captivity. Antonescu was captured after the war, tried for war crimes, and executed by firing squad in 1946. He sent his own country's sons to die on a flank he knew couldn't hold. The next general on this list didn't sacrifice his men's lives. He almost lost the war by losing his nerve at the worst possible moment. Chapter 6. The General Who Lost Control. Courtney Hodges commanded the American First Army during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Germany launched its last great offensive in the West. For the opening days of the battle, one of America's largest field armies was thrown into confusion. The attack came before dawn on December 16th. German forces smashed through a lightly defended sector of the Ardennes, creating the largest crisis the Western Allies had faced since Normandy. Entire American units were cut off. Communications broke down. Nobody knew exactly how large the German offensive really was. The situation was changing by the hour. Hodges struggled to build an accurate picture of the battlefield. Reports from the front contradicted one another. Headquarters had difficulty maintaining contact with several formations, and the First Army temporarily lost control of parts of the rapidly changing front. But here's the detail many people overlook. Several senior Allied commanders later questioned whether Hodges had adapted quickly enough to the scale of the German breakthrough. General Omar Bradley later acknowledged the confusion surrounding First Army headquarters during those crucial opening days, while General Eisenhower reorganized parts of the Allied command structure to improve coordination as the crisis unfolded. The German offensive eventually stalled. As reinforcements arrived and the weather improved, Hodges's First Army recovered, helped stop the German advance, and later played a major role in driving the enemy back across the Rhine. History remembers the Battle of the Bulge as an American victory. What it often forgets is how close the opening days came to becoming something very different. Hodges recovered and finished the war successfully. The final commander on this list never recovered from the consequences of his decisions. His army kept winning battles, but somehow still managed to lose the war. Chapter 7. The General Who Lost China Repeatedly. Shunroku Hata commanded Japanese forces in China across multiple campaigns and managed to turn Japan's overwhelming material and numerical advantages into a series of strategically meaningless victories that drained Japanese resources without achieving decisive results. Hata served as commander-in-chief of the China Expeditionary Army during some of the most critical years of Japan's war in China. The fundamental problem was consistent. Japanese forces under his command could win tactical engagements, but never converted those victories into strategic outcomes that actually ended Chinese resistance. Operation Ichigo in 1944, the largest Japanese land offensive of the entire war, fell under his area of command. Japan committed 500,000 soldiers and achieved its tactical objectives. Then the strategic results failed to materialize. Chinese forces retreated, regrouped, and continued fighting. American air bases were captured, but American air power simply relocated. Japan had spent irreplaceable men and resources on an operation that changed almost nothing strategically. Hata was captured after Japan's surrender and tried by an Allied military tribunal. He was convicted of war crimes related to his command responsibility for atrocities committed by forces under his authority in China. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and released in 1954. He presided over the largest Japanese land operation of the war. It solved nothing. It cost everything Japan put into it. And the war in China continued until Japan surrendered everywhere else first. 7 generals, 7 different armies. 7 different ways of failing the men who trusted them and the countries that sent them. Irwin attacked the same position until men stopped coming back. Lucas froze when the road to Rome was open. Brauchitsch backed down every time Hitler raised his voice. Gordov collapsed under pressure and paid for his opinions with his life. Antonescu sent 300,000 of his own countrymen to die on a flank he knew would break. Hodges nearly lost his nerve during the most critical 72 hours of the Western campaign. Hata spent irreplaceable Japanese resources winning battles that changed nothing. Not one of them set out to fail. Every single one of them did anyway. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. You don't want to miss it.